Ancient Egypt endured for over 3,000 years. Few civilizations have matched its longevity, but even the most resilient societies are not immune to slow erosion. Egypt's decline was not the result of a single catastrophe. It was a gradual unraveling, shaped by environmental shifts, economic pressures, and the quiet breakdown of institutions that had once held the kingdom together. For centuries, Egypt's strength rested on the predictability of the Nile. Annual floods brought nutrient-rich silt to the fields, sustaining agriculture and supporting a complex society. But climate patterns are not permanent. Evidence indicates that irregular flooding became more common during the later periods of Egyptian history. When floods arrived too early or too late, harvests suffered. When they failed entirely, famine followed. A civilization built on agricultural surplus found itself vulnerable to forces beyond its control. Economic strain compounded these environmental challenges. Egypt's wealth had long depended on trade networks that stretched across the Mediterranean and into Africa and the Near East. But maintaining these networks required stability. As neighboring regions experienced their own upheavals, trade routes became less reliable. The flow of luxury goods, timber, and metals slowed. Revenue declined. The state's ability to fund monumental projects, maintain temples, and support its administrative apparatus weakened. The administrative system itself grew increasingly complex over time. What had once been a centralized bureaucracy became fragmented. Regional governors accumulated power. Local elites began to prioritize their own interests over those of the central authority. Historians suggest that this decentralization eroded the state's capacity to respond to crises. When problems arose, coordination became difficult. Resources were not efficiently allocated. Trust in central institutions diminished. The priesthood, once a stabilizing force, also became a source of tension. Temples controlled vast estates and employed thousands of workers. They accumulated wealth that rivaled the state itself. This created a parallel power structure that sometimes competed with secular authorities. Resources that might have strengthened the kingdom's defenses or infrastructure instead supported religious institutions. The balance between sacred and political authority, carefully maintained for centuries, began to tip. Military capacity declined alongside these internal pressures. Egypt's army had once been a formidable force, capable of projecting power across the region. But sustaining a professional military required consistent funding and effective organization. As the economy weakened and administration fragmented, military readiness suffered. Equipment became outdated. Training standards dropped. The recruitment of foreign mercenaries, once a supplement to Egyptian forces, became a necessity. This created dependencies that further undermined sovereignty. Technological stagnation played a role as well, while neighboring civilizations developed new metallurgical techniques, improved shipbuilding methods, and more efficient agricultural tools. Egypt's innovation slowed. The society that had once led the ancient world in engineering and craftsmanship found itself falling behind. This was not due to a lack of intelligence or capability, but rather a combination of economic constraints and cultural conservatism. When resources are scarce, experimentation becomes risky. Social cohesion also began to fracture. Egypt's population was diverse, comprising different ethnic groups, languages, and cultural traditions. For much of its history, a shared religious and political identity held these groups together, but as economic conditions deteriorated and central authority weakened, divisions became more pronounced. Research points to periods of internal migration and social unrest. People moved in search of better conditions. Communities that had coexisted peacefully found themselves in competition for dwindling resources. The written record itself reflects this fragmentation. Inscriptions from earlier periods demonstrate consistent administrative language and unified messaging. Later texts show regional variations and conflicting accounts of the same events, suggests not only political division but also the breakdown of shared narratives that had once unified the kingdom. Infrastructure maintenance suffered as well. The irrigation systems that had made Egyptian agriculture so productive required constant upkeep. Canals needed dredging. Levees required reinforcement. Storage facilities demanded repair. These were unglamorous tasks that fell to local authorities with diminishing resources and motivation. As infrastructure deteriorated, agricultural productivity declined further, creating a downward spiral that proved difficult to reverse. Foreign pressures added another layer of stress. Egypt had long interacted with neighboring civilizations, sometimes through trade, sometimes through conflict. But by the later periods, new powers were rising. The Assyrians, Persians, and eventually the Greeks and Romans possessed military and organizational advantages that Egypt struggled to match. These were not sudden invasions that destroyed the kingdom overnight. Rather, they were persistent pressures that Egypt, already weakened from within, found increasingly difficult to resist. Cultural adaptability, once a hallmark of Egyptian civilization, also showed signs of rigidity. For centuries, Egypt had absorbed foreign influences while maintaining its core identity. But as challenges mounted, there appears to have been a retreat into tradition. Innovation slowed. The society that had pioneered advances in engineering, medicine, and administration became more conservative. Historians suggest this reflected a loss of confidence, a sense that the old ways, if preserved carefully enough, might restore past glory. The end of pharaonic Egypt was not a dramatic collapse. It was a slow fade. The last native dynasty fell to the Persians in the 4th century BCE. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt soon after, and it became part of the Hellenistic world. The Ptolemaic dynasty that followed was Greek, not Egyptian. When Cleopatra died, in 30 BCE, Egypt became a province of Rome. The temples continued for a time, the language survived. But the independent civilization that had flourished for millennia had ended. Egypt's decline illustrates a broader pattern in history. Civilizations rarely fall because of a single event. They weaken over time, as small stresses accumulate and systems that once functioned smoothly begin to fail. Environmental changes reduce agricultural output. Economic networks fray. Administrative structures lose coherence. Social bonds weaken. External pressures intensify. Each factor alone might be manageable, but together they become overwhelming. What remains remarkable is not that Egypt eventually declined, but that it endured for so long. The civilization adapted repeatedly, surviving invasions, droughts, and internal upheavals. But adaptability has limits. When the pressures became, it reminds us that longevity is never guaranteed, and that the strength of a civilization lies not in its monuments, but in its capacity to respond to change.